I'm Menachem Learfield, and this is Yada Yada Yiddish, where we learn Jewish lessons from episodes of Seinfeld. This week, we're going to explore the most iconic, perhaps, of all the Seinfeld episodes. Season 7, Episode 6, The Soup Nazi. There are so many Jewish themes that we can explore. Going just from the very opening of the episode, where Jerry comments that soup is the lazy man's food because half the work is already done for you.
Yes, I'm a very lazy eater. And that's why I like soup. First of all, it looks half digested when they put it down in front of you, so you feel like half the work is done already.
Which, of course, speaks to the Jewish philosophy around effort and how effort is not something to be shunned, but something that we appreciate, something that we encourage. And I think it speaks to our society and how much we try to avoid effort at all costs. We also have the theme of lashon hara, of gossip, of speaking negatively about others that comes up throughout the episode. As soon as George leaves, Jerry's girlfriend, Susan, says, "Ugh, what a weird guy."
So we'll meet you and Susan at the movie tonight.
You know what? I changed my mind. I don't think so.
Just like that?
Just like that.
Boy, he's a weird guy, isn't he?
We find that George and Elaine, when they're together, start talking negatively and gossiping about Jerry.
Hey, let me ask you something. Is it just me, or do you find it unbearable to be around Jerry and that girl?
Oh, I know. It's awful.
I mean, why do they have to do that in front of people?
I don't know.
What is that with the schmoopy?
Oh.
You schmoopy.
Oh, stop it. I know.
And this theme continues throughout the episode. We see the idea of self-control. George knows what he needs to do to get his soup. He knows that in order to get the soup, he needs to follow the rules, and he cannot help himself. There's no bread in the bag, and he wants the bread, and even though he wants the soup more, he cannot have the self-restraint to keep his mouth shut.
Medium turkey chili. I didn't get any bread.
Just forget it, let it go.
Excuse me, I think you forgot my bread.
Bread, $2 extra.
$2, but everyone in front of me got free bread.
You want bread?
Yes, please.
$3! What? No soup for you!
He gets nothing. We see the concept of chesed as Kramer agrees to babysit the armoire that Elaine buys, but she cannot move in that day.
What do you mean I can't bring it in here? I live here.
It's Sunday, Elaine. There's no moving on Sunday. That's the rule. Ahoy there!
Oh, Kramer. Thank God. I really appreciate your doing this.
Yeah, well, you asked for it, you got it.
Really nice to do something kind for a friend, and we see how Elaine repays the favor by going to get him soup from the soup Nazi.
Do you need anything?
Well, how bowl of mulligatawny would hit the spot.
Also in the realm of chesed, the soup Nazi does a really kind thing, and he gives his armoire to Kramer's friend, not knowing it was Elaine. And then when he learns that it was Elaine, he has what we call charata. He has regret. He wishes that he wouldn't have ever even done that nice thing. Ultimately, chesed, kindness, is meant to be done regardless of who the recipient is.
Kramer gave me the armoire, and it is so beautiful. I mean, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
You? If I knew it was for you, I never would have given it to him in the first place. I would have taken a hatchet and smashed it to pieces.
Why should he change his mind about doing this act of kindness because of who the recipient is? Another fascinating thing that we see in the episode is how everyone refers to this man as a soup Nazi, but Kramer actually sees eye to eye with him.
The soup Nazi?
He's not a Nazi. He just happens to be a little eccentric. You know, most geniuses are.
Because Kramer, too, is a little eccentric. We see the world not the way it is, but the way we are, and therefore we see other people the way we are. There are some people who everyone else can't stand, and for whatever reason, we are connected with them. We're like kindred spirits. Why? Because we have some common ground. So when there's somebody that we don't like, perhaps we can just explore what common ground we have with them. And we can begin to see them not as someone who's off or bad or negative, but as someone who might just be a little different. And we can learn to see the good in others the same way Kramer sees the good in the soup Nazi. Even though those are all valid avenues that we can go down to explore Jewish themes in this episode, we see the idea of being clear about one's priorities and what they should be. Jerry's online with his girlfriend, and she gets in trouble by the soup Nazi, and he kicks her out, right? No soup for you.
How dare you? Come on, Jerry, we're leaving.
And then Jerry pretends like he doesn't even know her. He says,
Do I know you?
later, as he's processing all of this with Elaine, she points out, rightfully so, that he has his priorities messed up.
So essentially, you chose soup over a woman.
It was a bit.
Yeah, you know what I've just realized? Suddenly, George has become much more normal than you.
Really?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. He's engaged to be married. Your top priority is soup.
Have you tasted the soup?
Yeah, all right, you made the right decision.
He acknowledges that that's where his priorities are. Soup was more important than the love of his life. How often in life do we mismatch our priorities? We know that our priorities should be the people in our lives, the ones who we love, our family, our spouse, our children, and yet we put silly things ahead of them. We don't live life in line with our priorities. Those are all excellent Jewish themes that we get out of this episode. But without a doubt, the overarching theme of the episode is the idea of rules. The entire episode involves the cast trying to get soup from the soup Nazi, an individual who has very strict rules for how his soup should be ordered, purchased, and consumed. And if you break any of the rules, you don't get any soup. You can get banned for soup for a year.
No soup for you. Come back 1 year.
We see the subplot of the episode with Elaine not being able to move her armoire into the apartment because there's this arbitrary rule and there's no moving on Sundays. And this gets, placed so perfectly into the episode, which is all about rules. This speaks to the Jewish obsession with rules. We have so many rules given to us in our Torah. But it's important to keep in mind some very important distinctions. Number one is the rules that we have, we believe, were given to us by God himself, not as arbitrary rules, but as the instructions for living, how to get the most out of our souls, the most out of our lives. Secondly, they're not arbitrary. The rules are there for a reason. What makes the episode so funny, the humor in the Soup Nazi episode, what makes it such a classic, iconic episode, is how so much emphasis is placed on these rules that are ridiculous, that are arbitrary, that have no basis whatsoever, where the Soup Nazi himself is putting himself in a position of power, and he has the rules just to enforce that power. That is not at all what Torah Judaism is all about. When we look at the Torah's rules, when we look at the Torah laws, the laws of Judaism are there for us and for our benefit and for our purpose. And if we want a way out of those rules, we can find it. There's a clip that's been surfacing on social media from a man named Gilad, who wants to claim that Jews are really allowed to eat meat and milk together. And really all this time we've been avoiding cheeseburgers based on a mistake. Now, Gilad is an expert on Jewish history and the Hebrew language, or at least he claims to be. And somehow he's gotten himself mixed into, trying to explain and understand Jewish laws and whether they are binding or not binding. Now, I don't think that somebody who's an expert in Hebrew really has the authority to talk about Jewish tradition and Jewish law, but let's take a look at the clip. Let's hear his claim, and then let's go through it piece by piece and try to understand whether or not it has any factual basis.
Jews can eat cheeseburgers due to a misunderstanding. I'm Elon Gilad. I write about Hebrew and Jewish history. Let me explain. The source of the prohibition on mixing dairy with meat comes from a single verse that appears twice in the Bible. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk. The rabbis took this ban on cooking a goat in its mother's milk and extended it to all meat and dairy, even chicken, which doesn't even produce milk. But what if this isn't what the verse meant at all? When we look at the verse in Deuteronomy, it appears with other dietary laws, but in its earlier original appearance in Exodus, the context is completely different. It's among laws about bringing animals for sacrifice at the temple. So why would a cooking rule appear there? Here's the key. Hebrew is written without vowels, so we can't be certain about some words. The verb translated as seethe, tevashel, could just as easily be tafshil, meaning ripen or mature. This makes much more sense in context. What the verse actually meant was, when your she-goat gives birth, don't wait for the newborn to ripen on its mother's milk. Bring it to the temple right away. It's amazing from this tiny misunderstanding, a whole set of dietary rules emerged, affecting millions for thousands of years.
This video is by a gentleman named Gilad, who claims to be an expert in Jewish history and in the Hebrew language. And I don't doubt that he is an expert in any of those things, although I don't really know. But clearly from his video, he does not have a lot of background in Judaism. So as a rabbi, I feel like it is my responsibility to set something straight. And I'd like to go through his video piece by piece and talk about what is true, what is not true, and just give it some context. So he claims that the reason why we don't eat cheeseburgers, meaning the reason why Jews don't mix milk and meat, is based on a misunderstanding. And we are so grateful, after thousands of years of being in the dark and not understanding this properly, that now, finally, Elon has come and enlightened us so that we can now eat cheeseburgers. So, first of all, before we even start, Elon, if you're hungry and you want to eat cheeseburgers, which I assume that you do anyway, you don't need to use the Torah as rationalization and justification. You don't need to bend normative halacha just because you want to do something that the Torah clearly says is forbidden. If you want to eat the cheeseburger, we're not going to judge you. Just go for it. But you don't need to mislead people on social media who don't know any better into thinking that what you're saying is actually halachically correct. So let's go through your claim piece by piece. First, we have to address the arrogance in your statement, that we have been so misguided and so misunderstood, and all of the great sages that came before you didn't understand the way to read a simple verse in the Torah. Now, I don't know what your qualifications are. I really don't. I don't know who you are, and I'm sure you're well-meaning. But you start off by talking about how this verse in the Torah is mentioned twice.
The source of the prohibition on mixing dairy with meat comes from a single verse that appears twice in the Bible. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk.
When even a school child will tell you that it's mentioned 3 times. We find the verse, Lo sevashel Gedi b'chalev imo, that one shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk, which is, as you correctly said, the source for the prohibition against mixing meat and milk. We find it not 2 times, as you mentioned, but 3 times. I would think if you don't even know how many times the verse is mentioned in the Torah, you're probably not an expert to speak on what the verse actually means, especially when your interpretation goes against all the interpretations of all the commentaries and all of the classic authorities that we turn to for knowledge in Judaism. It's actually mentioned 3 times. The first time we find this verse is in Exodus 23:19, where the verse says, Reishis bikurei ad mascha tavi beis Hashem Elokecha, that the bikurim, the first fruits, the choicest fruits, you shall bring to the house of God, Hashem your God, which is referring to the Beit HaMikdash. Lo sevashel Gedi b'chalev imo, and you shall not cook a Gedi, we'll translate that a little bit later, b'chalev imo, in the milk of its mother. We find the same verse repeated verbatim in Exodus 34:26, and because it is repeated verbatim, maybe that's why you didn't include it as a separate verse, but it is a separate verse, and that's a very important fundamental difference that it's mentioned 3 times and not 2 times. And then the third time we find it is in the book of Deuteronomy. In 14:21, the verse says, Lo sochlu kol nevela, you shall not eat a nevela. A nevela is a animal carcass, so an animal that was not killed properly. Leger asher b'sharecha titnena, you shall give it to the ger that is within your community to eat. V'achlan, he will eat it. And it's not referring to the ger as a convert, but it refers to a ger toshav, which is a non-Jewish person who lives within the Jewish community. Oh, machar lanachri, or you can sell it to a non-Jew. Ki am kadosh ata, because you are a consecrated people. You are a holy people. La Hashem Elokecha, to Hashem your God. Lo sevashel Gedi b'chalev imo, you shall not boil a Gedi in the milk of its mother. And in this last time in Deuteronomy, it's clearly referring to dietary laws, and it's included within other dietary laws, other laws of kosher. So it's not mentioned twice, it's mentioned 3 times. I would think if you don't know how many times the verses are mentioned, maybe you shouldn't speak on the topic. Now, just before we go into this, it's important to put this into proper context. There are people in the comments of your video who say, oh, now all the fanatics are going to get all upset that you are, contesting what they say or what their rabbis say. It's not just that the arrogance involved in your statement and in your contention that is going against so many great people who came before you. It's not just the arrogance that we take issue with. It's the stupidity of such an argument. I just want to give you a quick example. Years ago, I was giving a class, and I mentioned some commentary of Rashi. Rashi is our classic commentator. He has written on practically all of classic Jewish sources, and he is the person we turn to always to understand what we call the pashut, pshat, the words in front of us. And I give this interpretation of Rashi, and somebody raises their hand and says, Rabbi, that's very nice that Rashi says that, but I say this. And he proceeded to give his own interpretation. And I said to him, it's not that you're not allowed to argue on Rashi. It's not that Rashi is infallible. It's not that Rashi isn't a human being. He is. But he was a person who knew this a lot better than you do. I said, Rashi is somebody who knew the entirety of the Torah by heart. He knew every single verse, and that means that every time he gives a piece of commentary, every time he comments on a verse, he is taking into consideration every other letter and word of every other verse in the entire Torah. He's also taking into consideration all of the other ideas that he shared and all of the other pieces of commentary that he has given to make sure that nothing is contradicting anything else that he said. This gentleman didn't agree. He couldn't understand, he couldn't fathom the fact that Rashi really understood or knew all the verses in the Torah by heart. He said, there's no way Rashi knew all the verses in the Torah. And I looked at him and I said, I know school children, 7, 8, 9 years old, who know every single verse in the Torah by heart. I don't. I'll be the first to admit I don't. But I've met children in Israel who study Torah all day and all night, 364 days a year they go to school. And I'm not saying that that's a healthy system, or I'm not saying that that's what you should do, or that it's not a healthy system. I'm not commenting at all on that system of education. I'm just saying that I have met children, 7 years old, who you can open up the Chumash to a random verse. You can quote them chapter and verse, and they will read you that verse by heart backwards, word by word, because they know it all by heart. Now, if you don't have that kind of knowledge, to argue on Rashi who did is just silly because it is short-sighted. There's one thing to ask questions. As Jews, we ask questions all the time. That's what these podcasts are all about. We are the wondering people. We are. There's nothing wrong with asking the questions. And you point out some interesting questions, classic questions that are addressed by our commentators. But to go from the question to the assumption and the assertion you make is taking a leap that is just too great. And it would beg the question that I would ask you, which is, if you have different interpretations in front of you, why do you choose this one? We are very aware of the ability of the human being to rationalize. That's what we do. We're rationalizing beings. And as we've talked about in other episodes, the mind follows the heart. If you want something to be true, you can find a way to make it true. We always have to ask ourselves, what is our bias? What information do we want to be true? And are we swaying the data? Are we swaying the information to make that true? So clearly, somebody who eats non-kosher and considers themselves a biblical scholar will want to try and show, and that's plain cognitive dissonance. One of the ways to resolve cognitive dissonance is to show that what you're doing is really not forbidden. It was just a misunderstanding. It was just a mistake. I understand the bias on that side. What about all the people who came before you? What is their bias? What is their vested interest in not being allowed to eat milk and meat? Let's just say for a second, we don't understand the verse. Let's say it's unclear. And let's say I have two ways of looking at it. One is that it's forbidden, and the other that it's permitted. If I'm not sure and I'm in a state of doubt, why would I choose one versus the other? If not for the fact that I want the other to be true. If we weren't sure what to do, we would assume better safe than sorry. Let's go with a stricter opinion. But that's besides the point, because many of the points that you assert are just not factually correct. So let's go through them one by one. You translate the verse, Lo savashel Gedi b'chalev imo, that you shall not boil or seethe is the word you use so many times. You shall not seethe a kid in its mother's milk.
Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk. The rabbis took this ban on cooking a goat in its mother's milk and extended it to all meat and dairy, even chicken, which doesn't even produce milk.
And you then make the assertion that the rabbis then extended it to other animals, even chicken, you point out, that does not have or produce any milk. So first off, Rashi, again, going back to our classic commentator, feels the need to prove you wrong. And he explains that the word Gedi, kid, doesn't actually mean kid. Yes, I am familiar with Chad Gadya. We sing it at the Passover Seder. I know that a Gedi can mean a kid, but Rashi explains as follows. I'm reading you directly from Rashi, and this is going on that very first source in Exodus that we mentioned. Rashi says, when the Torah says, Lo savashel Gedi, you shall not cook a Gedi, what does that mean? Af egel v'keves bechlal Gedi. A calf and a keves, a sheep, is bechlal Gedi, is included in this word Gedi. She'ein Gedi ela lashon vlad rach. This expression, Gedi, this word, only means a young vlad, a young calf, a young animal. And how do I know this? Rashi can't just say anything on social media because he feels like it. He has to actually back it up with fact. So how do I know that when the Torah uses the word Gedi, it doesn't just mean a kid, rather it can mean other animals? Because I see many instances, many places in the Torah, shekasav Gedi, where it writes the word Gedi, v'hitzrich lefaresh achrav izim, and then it needs to say afterwards, I'm talking about goats. So it doesn't say the word Gedi by itself. It says kigon, and he gives an example, anochi ashalach Gedi izim in Bereshis Lamed Ches, in the book of Genesis 38, where it says not just Gedi, it says Gedi izim. And then he brings another example where it says Gedi ha'izim. And then he brings another example in chapter Chaf Zayin where it says Gedaye izim. So in all of these cases, why didn't it just say Gedi by itself? L'lamedcha, to teach you, shekol makom shenemar Gedi stam, that any time it says the word Gedi by itself, without any qualification, without qualifying what the type of Gedi we're talking about, af egel v'keves b'mashma, it includes all kinds of land animals. It includes a calf, it includes a sheep, it includes all those animals. Therefore, according to normative halacha, a cow and other non-kid animals are not rabbinically forbidden, they are biblically forbidden. The rabbis didn't introduce that law, the Torah introduced that law. So your first assertion that this is all rabbinic with the exception of a kid is incorrect. You are correct that chicken is a rabbinic ordination, forbidding us to eat chicken with milk, but that has nothing to do with the verse, and therefore has nothing to do with this conversation. The rabbis made a separate legislation to forbid us from eating chicken with milk mixed together, and that was for a different reason that has nothing to do with this verse. And the rabbis are given the mandate by the Torah itself to create these fences around the law, as well as make their own rabbinic laws. But again, this has nothing to do with our discussion, because in our discussion, we're not talking about any rabbinic laws. We're talking about the biblical laws of mixing meat and milk together. But mixing meat and milk of any land animal is included in the prohibition of mixing milk and meat in that verse and is biblically forbidden. And we are required to follow that rabbinic law the same way we follow the biblical law, because the Torah itself in Deuteronomy 17:11 requires us to follow those laws and those mandates that the rabbis legislated.
When we look at the verse in Deuteronomy, it appears with other dietary laws, but in its earlier original appearance in Exodus, the context is completely different. It's among laws about bringing animals for sacrifice at the temple. So why would a cooking rule appear there?
So you ask, why would the verse telling us not to mix milk and meat together, why is this verse, Lo sevashel Gedi b'chalei v'mo, not to seethe a Gedi in its mother's milk? Why is that mentioned specifically with bringing the first fruits or bringing the offerings in the temple? And that is actually an excellent question. So good job. That was a phenomenal question. Not only is it a good question, it's not an original question. You're not the first person to ask that question. Many of our commentators ask that question as well, and they give all kinds of answers. What they don't say is, therefore, we're allowed to mix milk and meat together. Because, again, they didn't have that same bias. They didn't have a reason why they wanted to eat it, and therefore they were trying to justify it. They had intellectual honesty. They were trying to truly understand what the verse was saying. Before we begin this discussion, it's important to keep in mind that when we look and approach any Torah learning, we have to understand that every single letter of the Torah is chosen for a specific reason. We don't have a single extra letter. That means every single word, every single verse, the placement of that verse is there to teach me something. It's like a Swiss Army knife. It doesn't just cut, but it can also be a can opener, and it can also be a nail file, and it could also be a corkscrew. It could do all of these multiple things, and the way the Torah does that is by being very concise and not wasting an extra letter. So that means if I can teach you an idea or a concept just by placing the verse somewhere, or by adding an extra letter, or taking away an extra letter, we will learn something from it. And that's what the Talmud goes through. It goes through all the different ways that we see what the Torah is truly saying without looking at just the words, but what is really contained, hidden within the words. So when we see a verse like these dietary laws of not mixing meat and milk, and they are in a place that we wouldn't expect them to be, it's there to teach us a lesson. And that is exactly what you're asking. What is the lesson that it's trying to teach us? One could say that it's trying to completely change the meaning of the verse, and it was a mistake, or however else you want to say it. And it's teaching me that really I'm allowed to mix meat and milk together. But that's not what any of our classic commentators said. Let's look at what they actually said. The 13th century French rabbi and biblical commentator Chizkuni explains that at the time of the festivals, we are eating a lot of meat. So those who have been to Jewish holidays, you know, we like to eat, and we eat a lot. And we specifically eat a lot of meat. And because we're consuming so much meat during this time, the Torah at this point wants to remind us not to mix meat and milk together. It's saying, I know you're about to consume large amounts of meat. You're going to be cooking it in all different ways. Just be aware that you're not allowed to mix it with milk. And that's why it appears right here during the discussion of the festivals. Rabbi Moshe David Kasuto, another classic commentator, explains that this entire verse is contrasting to what the non-Jewish nations of the world used to do at that time. So he says, just like they bring their finest first fruits to their gods in their temples, so shall you bring the bikurim, the first fruits, not just any fruits, but the choicest of the fruits, to your God in our temple. But, he points out, the verse warns us that that's where the similarities stop, because the non-Jewish nations would mix meat and milk together. And the Torah is telling us when you bring these offerings to your God, don't mix milk and meat together, because you're not allowed to cook meat and milk together. That is his interpretation of why we find the verse specifically here. And then we get to Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch. He explains that one of the reasons why we don't mix meat and milk together in the first place, and this is very important for those who haven't listened to our episode on our approach to the reasons given in the Torah. When he says this is a reason, he doesn't mean this is the only reason, nor does he mean that if the reason doesn't apply, therefore the law doesn't apply. I don't want this to be taken out of context. But he explains one of the reasons why we don't mix meat and milk together is that milk is life-giving. It represents the idea of giving life to something. And meat, on the other hand, is the flesh, the sinews, the fat. It is that which is very base and physical. And Rabbi Hirsch says it's very important that we keep those things separate, that we understand that we have the ability to leave our physical base selves aside and to elevate ourselves and be more spiritual. And he explains that that is why we find these verses that talk about not mixing meat and milk specifically over here. Because we are on our way, as at this point in the verses, we are on our way to the temple. We are on our way to do this spiritual service. We are on our way to bring the bikurim, the first fruits. And says Rav Hirsch, somebody that mixes meat and milk, not just physically in the way we eat, but in what they represent, somebody that gives into their baser side, their animalistic side, is somebody that invalidates the holy service of the temple and somebody that invalidates the gift that they are giving with the Bikurim. And therefore, the verse is specifically here to say, don't invalidate, don't pervert the spiritual essence that you have inside by mixing those two things together. Specifically when I'm bringing the Bikurim, specifically when I'm going to the temple and going on this pilgrimage festival, specifically at those moments when I'm about to do something spiritual, Rabbi Hirsch says, remind us that we have to be spiritual. Rabbi Hirsch says the verse is placed specifically there to remind us to connect and hold on to the spiritual without falling into the depths of the physical. Now, it's important to keep in mind there are many other interpretations that are given as to why this verse is here. All of them are addressing the same question that you're coming from. They are not here, right? This is not me speaking, trying to say that you're wrong. You are wrong. But this is not me coming to give these reasons as reasons why you're wrong. These are interpretations that were given many, many years ago by people who were just looking intellectually, honestly at the verse and said, I wonder why the Torah chose to place this verse specifically here. And they give answers. None of them say because it's okay to mix meat and milk together. The closest thing we have is the Bechor Shor, which we'll get to as I actually look at your argument itself. But that will have to wait until further in our discussion because we're going in order of your video.
Hebrew is written without vowels, so we can't be certain about some words.
And that's true. Hebrew is written without vowels. And there are many words in the Torah that you wouldn't be able to understand if you didn't know what they were saying. Luckily, in Judaism, we have the written law and the oral law, and we believe both were given at Sinai to the Jewish people. What that means is that the oral law, and there's a lot of confusion around this, the oral law is not rabbinic law. That is very different. Oral law is biblical law as handed down from generation to generation in an unbroken chain from Moses at Sinai to us today in 2025. That is not rabbinic law. Now, how do we know that there is an oral law? It's funny, but one of the proofs that's given is this verse itself. The Torah says, and I'm surprised that you didn't bring this down in your video, maybe just because Instagram is short form and you didn't have the time to bring it down, but this is a classic example that's given to show that we know that there's an oral law because otherwise I can't understand the verse. Now, it's interesting, nobody goes to the lo sevashel part. They go to the chalev imo. So the word chalev imo means the milk of its mother, but it can also, again, using the exact same letters, it can mean chalev, which means forbidden fats. So how do we know if the verse is telling us that we can't mix meat and milk together, or if the Torah is telling us not to mix meat and forbidden fats together? Maybe that's what the verse means. And the response that's been given for over 2,000 years is that's why we have the oral transmission. That I know how to read the verse because my father knew how to read the verse and his father knew how to read the verse and our teachers knew how to read the verse. And that's the basis of the Torah. I know how to read the verses because that is what was given to me with the oral transmission of the Torah. There must have been an oral component. Otherwise, you're right, I would have no way to read the verse. Luckily, there is an oral transmission. And therefore, I know how to read the verse. And I know that sivashel is sivashel, which means to cook or to sieve, as you say. And it's not referring to chalev, fat. It's referring to chalav, milk. One of the reasons is simply, otherwise we would have no way, as you said, to read the Torah itself. And yet there are no scholars that have basis anywhere in the world that read it differently. If you met a Jew in Paris, or you met a Jew in Uganda, or you met a Jew in America, they are all reading the same Torah every single week. And as we read the Torah in our synagogue every week, if somebody said the wrong word and they pronounced it differently, even if it could be pronounced in that same way, but they said the letter wrong or the vowel wrong, you will hear a bunch of people yelling at them and correcting them. Why, might you ask? Why can't we just let it be? The reason why we don't just let it be is so that we don't have these mistakes creep in. It's important that when we read the Torah, if there's a mistake that's made, either a mistake in the words or a mistake in the pronunciation, that we don't just continue and let it go and let it slide. that we correct it to make sure that everyone there understands how to properly read the verse. So that's one way we know that there is an oral Torah, because otherwise we can't even read the words. But there's many other examples. For example, the Torah tells us, as we say in the Shema, that we have to put on tefillin. But all it says is that you shall bind these things on your arm and you should have these things be totafot, which means tefillin. It doesn't tell us what the tefillin are. How do I know that they have to be black boxes? How do I know what the parchments are inside? And yet, if I find a pair of tefillin from 2,000 years ago, which they have found, they will be boxes. They will have the same parchments inside. And if I open up a pair of tefillin, again, in France, or in America, or in Israel, there's no doubt what the tefillin look like, even though the Torah gives no description. The same thing with the mezuzah on our doorpost. It says that you should put this mezuzah on your doorpost. It doesn't say what it is, doesn't say what's written inside of it, doesn't say any of that. So how do we all know that the mezuzah is written on a scroll and it has specific chapters that come from the Shema? How do I know? How do I know which side of the doorpost it goes on? All of these things are established and well understood, even though the Torah doesn't make any mention of it. Where is any of that found? It's found in the Oral Torah itself. Also in the Shema, we have the commandment to wear tzitzit on our garments, but it doesn't say what tzitzit are. Does that mean that we should put some sort of sticker on the corner of our garment? Does it mean that we should paint something onto it? Or does it mean the strings? If you go anywhere in the Jewish world and you ask somebody what are tzitzit, they'll know exactly what we're talking about, even though the Torah makes no mention of what these things actually are. Perhaps the best example are the laws of shechita, the laws of ritually preparing an animal for slaughter. The Torah says that you should perform these ritual slaughterings as I have commanded you, and yet it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah from beginning to end any of these detailed laws. So what does it mean, as I have commanded you? It means, as I have commanded you in the Oral Torah. All of that is contained within the Oral Torah. That's not why we have the Oral Torah, but that's how we know that we for sure have an Oral Torah. Why would the Torah be given with an oral component as well as the written component? Just write it all down. First of all, the Torah is way too vast to be contained within the words themselves. Now, everything in the Oral Torah is hinted at in the written Torah. I can find allusions to it. I can find them actually baked into and written in the words themselves, but not in a way that I can just intelligibly read by picking it up. The Torah is far too vast. The Torah is a living Torah, and therefore it's not enough to just contain it within the words. I need to be able to contain it within an oral transmission that goes along with it. I would never consider going into surgery with a doctor that did an online version of medical school. In fact, they don't have online medical school. Why? Because with something as important as surgery, the doctor needs to have real-world experience. They need to see it in real life. They need to actually interact with the human beings. They have to interact in person with their teachers. They have to be able to ask questions and get answers. They have to be able to sink their teeth into the information, and they have to be able to practice in real life. The Torah is not just an intellectual pursuit. It is a way of life, and because of that, it needs to be lived and it needs to be studied in real life. Another benefit of having an oral component that goes along with the Torah is that it makes it more difficult to be manipulated by people like you. If the written Torah is only a piece of it, so that can be transmitted, that can be taken, that can be stolen, that can be perverted, that can be taken away. But the oral Torah lives within all of us, and because it's within all of us, and the Jewish people are scattered throughout the world, that can never be taken away. Because the essence of the Torah, which is the oral Torah, by the way, when God talks about making a covenant with the Jewish people, he says he makes the covenant specifically on the oral component of the Torah, because that is part and parcel of the Jewish people. That cannot be taken by anybody else. That cannot be perverted by anybody else. And that cannot be stolen as the written Torah can be stolen. Another reason is that the written word can often be taken out of context. Just look at the distinction between sending a text message versus having a conversation. Do you ever do that where you're texting with a friend and you say something and they take it completely the wrong way and then they get all upset and you're like, no, I didn't mean that. And then they're like, well, you said, and you go back and forth and you're like, if only there was a way, if only there was a way I can actually talk to the person and communicate what I'm really trying to say. And then you remember, oh yeah, I can make a phone call. The phone existed before texting. And then you talk on the phone, and within seconds, everything else gets clarified. The same is true with the Torah. In the written word, it's easy to miss things. It's easy to not understand what it means. But when there's an oral component, when we're actually having conversations about it, I can ask my questions, I can get the answer. I can have a more holistic approach to the Torah itself. Perhaps the most important reason why we have the Oral Torah is because it requires a person to have a relationship with their teacher. I can't just pick up the Torah by itself and understand it. I need a relationship between a teacher and a student, one that clearly you never had, and I feel bad that you didn't have that. But if you did, your teacher would set you straight. Your teacher would enlighten you and say, that was such a great question you asked. Let's approach some answers together in an intellectually honest way. When I have that relationship with the teacher, and I have a relationship with the Torah in a deep and authentic way, the Torah becomes a part of me. And then I can go and teach that to somebody else. And I can develop this deeper, stronger relationship with the people who are teaching Torah, and more importantly, with the Torah itself. So that is why the Torah is oral. And because we have the oral Torah, we know how to read the verses. And we don't get into this question where we're like, wait a second, am I reading it wrong? Have I been reading it wrong for 2,000 years? How is it that every single person that reads the Torah every single week all over the world in all different countries was reading it wrong all along until Elon Gilad came and enlightened us on how to properly read it? Thankfully, we know that we have a connection to Torah, and we know that we have a deep, unbroken chain of transmission of the Oral Torah, which tells us how to read the verses properly. So when we get somebody who tells us that we're reading it wrong, we don't get flustered, because we know that our chain of transmission is strong enough that it's not going to be broken by somebody who's coming with a newfangled understanding of how to read it. Could that be the way to read it? Yeah, which is why we need the oral transmission to tell us that you are wrong. It's fascinating to me how you seem to completely ignore the Oral Torah, but not in the way that everyone else has. Once again, you're not original. You're not the first person to say that you don't want to accept the validity of the Oral Torah, or that it even exists. There were many groups and sects, as well as individuals, who did that throughout the ages. But what was interesting is that those who chose to not accept the Oral Torah often did it as a chumrah. They did it as a stringency, not because they wanted to permit something. For example, just one example, the verse that talks about not making a fire on Shabbat says that one shall not have a fire in their dwellings on Shabbat. Now, if I'm looking at the verse by itself, without any commentary, without any oral Torah to go with it, it seems to say that I'm not allowed to have a fire burning in my house on Shabbos. What that would mean is I can't have lights, I can't have heat, I can't have hot food. So we had groups like the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, who, because they only believed in the validity of the written Torah and not the oral Torah, they were intellectually honest at least. They didn't say, well, we're only going to use it when it is convenient and when it allows me to eat what I want and do what I want. No, they used it across the board. And what that meant is, if they're not going to use the oral Torah, they're not using the oral Torah at all. And so on Shabbat, they sat in the dark. They had no lights. They ate cold food. One of the reasons why we have a custom to eat hot food on Shabbat, right? In any community you go to, you have some sort of version of cholent, which is kind of like a chili. It's a, it's called chamin in some communities. It's called cholent in others. Almost every Jewish community, or perhaps I would venture to say every Jewish community, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, have some version of that food, something that they start cooking on Friday that cooks slowly through Shabbat, and we eat it on Saturday for lunch. And we eat that as a way of showing that those Tzedukim, those people who denied the validity of the oral Torah, are wrong. And we are allowed to have our heat as long as we set it before Shabbos. And we are allowed to have our lights on as long as we set them before Shabbos. And we are allowed to eat hot food as long as it starts cooking before Shabbat begins. Again, just one example. But it's interesting that you are denying the validity of the oral Torah, but not in an intellectually honest way, in a way that suits the agenda that you already set from the beginning. Now let's get to your argument itself. You want to say that the word sevashel means to mature.
The verb translated as seethe, tevashel, could just as easily be tafshil, meaning ripen or mature.
And you are correct that there is precedent where we see talking about fruits maturing, it uses that same word. I'm surprised that you didn't actually use those as your proof. The Bechor Shor, who intellectually brings down this argument and says perhaps that's what the verse means, and he says if I looked at it in a vacuum and I looked at the verse specifically with the context without anything else, I might say that it means that we're waiting for the animal to mature the same way, and he brings the proof, unlike you. The same way I see that the fruit is waiting until it matures on the vine. Now, it's important to mention that even though the Bechor Shor brings this argument down, he does not therefore conclude that one is allowed to mix meat and milk together. He brings it as an intellectual exercise and says, if that's all I had was the pshat, if all I had was the words of the verse in front of me with the context of the words in front of it, that's what I would come out with. So you're in good company. But is that really what the verse means? Let's look at it again. We have 3 times the Torah mentions this verse, Lo savashel Gedi b'chalev imo, not to seethe a Gedi in its mother's milk. Why does it mention it 3 times? Normative Jewish law tells us that it mentions it 3 times to tell us that we have 3 distinct prohibitions. Unlike regular non-kosher, where I'm not allowed to eat it, but I can cook it, I can sell it, I can benefit from it. When it comes to the laws of milk and meat, we have 3 distinct prohibitions. I'm not allowed to cook meat and milk together. I'm not allowed to eat milk and meat together. And I'm not allowed to benefit from the mixture of milk and meat. So the Torah mentions it 3 times. Again, that's the way the Torah works. That's the way all of halacha is in the Torah. That the Torah says something and it says it cryptically in order for me to understand things without wasting any extra letters, and so that there needs to be this oral component that is sharing with me what the words actually mean. It's important to keep in mind also that it's not that the rabbis saw the verse and therefore made up a law because of the way the verse was or where it was contained or what the word said, this word or that word. We have the oral transmission. That means that when God came down and gave the Torah to the Jewish people, they knew that there was a law that they were not allowed to mix meat and milk together. In fact, that is where the customs of the holiday of Shavuos come from, why we eat dairy, because they just got these new laws. So at Sinai, the Jewish people knew and understood when they received the Torah, they were not allowed to mix meat and milk together. When Moses goes up to the mountain for 40 days, he is going through this process of learning Torah and being able to then transmit it to the Jewish people after the revelation at Sinai where God revealed himself to the entire Jewish people. He is learning where I see the oral Torah within the written Torah, where I see the allusions. But when it gets handed down, it's almost like backwards design. We know that we're not allowed to eat milk and meat together. We know we're not allowed to cook meat and milk. We know we're not allowed to benefit from it. How do I know that? Where do I see in the Torah? The Torah doesn't say all 3 of those things. So therefore, we understand that because it mentions it 3 times, that's telling me that there's 3 distinct prohibitions. So we have 3 verses. The last verse, you'll agree to me, is very clear. It's talking about dietary law. It's talking about the laws of kosher. It tells us very clearly we're not allowed to mix meat and milk together, and that is a law of kosher. Then you have the 2 verses in Exodus, which again are identical. And you want to argue that
What the verse actually meant was, when your she-goat gives birth, don't wait for the newborn to ripen on its mother's milk. Bring it to the temple right away.
first of all, at worst, it's ambiguous. It's unclear. You have a question. Why does this verse appear here? And we gave answers for that. There are lots of answers. It's unclear. So I have the verses in Exodus which are unclear. I have the verse in Deuteronomy which is crystal clear. Why would I not then assume that the entirety of all of it is going based on the laws of kosher, the laws of dietary restrictions as found in Deuteronomy where it is clear? If I have a place that's unclear and a place that is clear, wouldn't I start with the place that's clear, the place where I do understand it? The verse in Deuteronomy alone would be enough to tell me that the word sivashel does not mean to ripen, but it means to cook, because we're talking about the laws of cooking. We're talking about the laws of what we eat. So wouldn't that be enough to tell you that you're not allowed to eat cheeseburgers? Let's say, for example, that you're right and you're not. That the verses in Exodus were saying something totally different about not allowing the animal to ripen. Let's just say. The verse in Deuteronomy would still outlaw mixing meat and milk together. You still wouldn't be able to eat it. So you wouldn't know that you're not allowed to also cook it, you're not allowed to benefit from it. That's a separate argument, and we can get there a different time. But at the very least, you would have at least one source that tells you you're not allowed to mix meat and milk together. That you would agree with. I would say, if we're being intellectually honest, that the verse in Deuteronomy explains, or as we say in Yiddish, it bavorns your question. If the Bechor Shor is correct, and I would say you are correct as well, that is one way that I might look at the verse. I need the verse in Deuteronomy to tell me that you are wrong. I need the verse in Deuteronomy to tell me that all along, every time it mentions lo sevashel gedi b'chalev imo, not to cook a gedi, or not to be mevashel, a gedi in its mother's milk, it does not mean to wait for the animal to mature. It means not to cook the animal. How do I know that? Because it says in Deuteronomy that. That tells me what the previous two sources, which are ambiguous, really mean. And let's say it is ambiguous. Let's say I don't know. And it can very well be this one or that one. It can lean towards telling me I'm not allowed to eat milk and meat together. Or it will tell me that I am allowed to eat milk and meat together. If we're being intellectually honest and we're not sure which one to do, if somebody handed you two pieces of food and they said one of them is laced with cyanide and will kill you, and one of them is totally fine and delicious, what would your approach be? I don't know about you, but if I was given those two options, I would say on the chance that one of them is laced with cyanide, I'm not going to eat either one of them. So on the chance that we're not allowed to eat meat and milk mixed together, wouldn't that be enough to tell me that I shouldn't do it? Especially when I have the verse in Deuteronomy that really tells me what it means. But even if it didn't, I would think the fact that you are in a state of doubt would tell you better safe than sorry. Don't mix meat and milk together. Don't eat that mixture if it's going to come out that I'm eating something that's prohibited. That's what somebody that cares about God's instructions for living and cares about Torah law would actually do. The problem is, and that's why it's so interesting to me that you even begin the discussion, you don't care about any of those things. You don't believe that Torah is real. You don't believe that God is real. So if you don't believe that any of those things are true, then why are you even getting involved in this conversation? To summarize, the Torah was given with an oral transmission, an unbroken chain of transmission from generation to generation that tells us how to read the words of the Torah, and that tell us it's forbidden to cook, benefit, or eat a mixture of meat and milk together. That is not rabbinic law, as you argued, but it's actually biblical law, as handed down from generation to generation through the ages. The 3 verses, not 2 as you argued, are there to tell me those 3 different prohibitions, and the verse in Deuteronomy makes it clear that all along we're talking about cooking and not bringing animal sacrifices. Now you know.